Hi, I'm Kai Chan. I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia, and founder and lead of CoSphere, a community of small planet heroes, and a student-focused think tank. And I'm here with Nancy Kang for the first time, one of our brilliant co-hosts for Season 2. Nancy, can you introduce yourself to folks?
Hi, I'm Nancy Kang. I'm Canada Research Chair in Transnational Feminisms and Gender-Based Violence at the University of Manitoba, and Muriel Gold Professor at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at McGill University.
Wonderful. And you are here with me in the studio today so that we can have a conversation with somebody really special.
Absolutely.
Yeah, somebody who has actually relatively recently, this very year, been named as one of Time's 100 most influential people.
Dr. Suzanne Simard is a professor of forestry ecology at the University of British Columbia, and she's also a very renowned author of the 2021 New York Times bestseller, Finding the Mother Tree.
Yeah, her office is actually just a stone throw from here, if you can throw uphill, not far at all. And her work has been centered to several pieces that almost anybody that would be listening to would have heard, like James Cameron's Avatar, where the Tree of Souls was inspired partly by her work. That's amazing. I love that tree.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well, Dr. Simard's TED Talks have been seen over 10 million times. She's not only performed for the TED Youth Forum, but also for various other TED platforms. And could you tell us, Kai, about her central idea?
Yeah, I love this idea. And I didn't realize how early Dr. Simard was involved in this research until much more recently, after having been colleagues at UBC for already more than a decade. Dr. Suzanne Simard's work shows how connected things are in forests, below ground in particular, that trees are not only in communication with mycorrhizal fungi, but also with other trees, and not only between individuals that may in some cases be genetically connected, but also between individuals that are much less related and between species, and sometimes in predictable ways between Douglas fir and aspen, I believe, or birch.
Cedar.
I don't know. She's going to tell us.
Dr. Simard will also be telling us about her seminal theory of mother trees, which really underscores the nurturing role that these large trees inhabit. She's also very well known for not only her humility, but also her capacity to speak to a broad range of thinkers as well as citizens. She's involved in citizen science projects, one of which is the Mother Tree Project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So not only has she published those 200 peer-reviewed articles, but she's actually trying to influence policy and practice and having some success in doing that, not only through the book and the TED Talks, but also through this project. I can't wait to talk to her.
We wanted to also mention that she is a consummate mentor. She's supervised over 30 PhD students as well as a number of postdocs, and she makes really an important contribution to the profile of women scientists in Canada and beyond.
Mm-hmm. And so for Season 2, with our theme being the role of science in transformative change, she's going to be a perfect person to talk to. She's got these contributions to how we think about forests as well as to the practice of forestry. And then she's got that mentorship and, broader engagement and community building. So every aspect of transformative change we're going to have in this one conversation.
Welcome, Dr. Simard.
There's a pit in your stomach from the way that we live. You want it to change, something's going to give. Well, we've got stories that'll give us a glimpse of better ways, reconnect everything. We're small planet heroes, small planet heroes.
Thank you so much. What a lovely conversation.
Hello, it's so great to have you here.
Well, it's nice to be here.
This is not going to be the normal conversation that you have about, it's not going to be centered necessarily around your book, although of course it's going to come up because it's such a great piece. It's going to be more thinking about your work in relation to big change, system change, or transformative change, as called by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. We're going to be thinking about how science sometimes plays an important role, how sometimes that role is limited in terms of its effect, and what it's like for those of us who are actually pushing for that kind of change from within the academy or from within a scientific perspective. Let's talk about you and your path into this role as a scientist and as an advocate. My first wondering is, you talk about speaking for the trees in your book, and the one that I think of most when I hear that term is the Lorax. Do you ever feel like the Lorax at all?
I think many people feel like the Lorax. I'm not, but I definitely relate to that character.
Did you read the Lorax when you were a kid?
I did. I mean, my parents read Dr. Seuss to us, and so yes. And then I read that to my own children.
Yeah. And you talk about how your early experiences in the forests, including with families that were involved in forestry, helped shape your views of those forests as well as your desire to understand them better. But how about that, like the urge to do something about it? When did that come about?
I think when I started working, so I graduated from UBC as a forestry student, and I started working in the forest industry. And what I was witnessing, what I had become part of, was if it graded the wrong way with me because it didn't fit with how I understood forests. I understood forests as whole systems. Like, I grew up in old growth forests, and think, back in the 1960s when I was a kid, the whole province was covered with old growth forests. That was the normal. And so we understood forests as deeply connected relational systems. And then forestry taught me that it wasn't that at all. That, it was all about the trees and growing trees for commodities to extract. and I thought, that's not, the forest is a living system. It supports us, and we're not looking after it in that way. So that's what got me going. I mean, I felt like I'd become part of this machine that was heading in the wrong direction. And I slowly realized it wasn't an overnight thing, but it was always grating me. And then I grew into who I am today.
Yeah. And so you grew into this identity of what we might call a revolutionary. I think a lot of the folks that we're going to have on this podcast, we might call that, in the sense that they're folks that are out there to change things in a big way. But would you wear that term, revolutionary, as a part of your identity?
I would never call myself that. I feel like I have a perspective that allowed me and an insight of where I came from, the family I grew up in, which were horse loggers, and then becoming it gave me an insight that a lot of people don't have. But the ideas that I have are ancient. So I'm not an inventor of these ideas. I'm just somebody to say, hey, there's another way to look at forests than we're doing right now. And it's got a lot of merit, and it could really help us as we move forward with global change.
Yeah. And it seems to need to be a pretty big change, right?
It is transformative. It has to be transformative.
Yeah, because the clear cuts that we see today, they do not reflect the science that you're famous for, right? If the soils are alive with these vibrant connections between trees and with the fungal networks, then what happens when we have a clear cut? Just describe it at the scale of possibly 1,000 hectares. Does that soil stay there and all the carbon within it?
So many things happen. And I invite viewers, if you get a chance to, go into an old growth forest. That's what a forest feels like. Then go into a plantation or a clear cut, and you'll immediately see the differences.
Yeah.
Immediately it's hotter. That's huge.
Yeah.
And then it's got a much different plant community. And that plant community is, adapted to these big open conditions. That plant community reflects what's going on below ground. So the fungal community, the soil food web, all gets changed because the plant community has changed above ground.
Because during the clear cut, most of those networks are going to die, right?
Yeah. So the mycorrhizas are that's what I've studied.
Yeah.
These linkers that link trees together. They're mycorrhizal fungi. And these are a particular kind of fungus that associates with trees or any kind of plant. There's only a few plant families. I think there's 5 in the world that don't have mycorrhizas. So all the other ones have them. And it's a highly evolved ancient symbiosis where the fungus grows through the soil and picks up water and nutrients and delivers it back to the tree or the plant. And the plant provides photosynthate in return. And so they're both getting their needs met. So if you take down the trees, you're also taking down those obligate mutualists that are the mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah.
It's not that they all completely disappear. Some are left behind, especially because there's other plants that still will come back, the early successional plants.
Mm-hmm.
But there are different suite of fungi than the ones that are on an old growth forest.
Yeah. And much of the carbon that's stored in that soil is then vulnerable, right, to being respired to the atmosphere and contributing to climate change.
Yeah.
I find it so funny when I understand your work and its implications for climate, the release of carbon and further exacerbating climate change. It makes me think for when I grew up, we distinguished between mining and the extraction of renewable resources. And I don't really see that much of a distinction anymore. Like, it feels like we're mining the soils with forests if we are stripping them so completely of the vegetation above ground that it's starving and killing the networks of all of these organisms below ground in effectively an irreversible way, because we're not replacing anywhere. We're not replacing those old growth forests with old growth forests in 400 years, right? The plan is to continue them harvesting them on as monocultures and even age stands over decades.
Yes, that's it. And you're right that it is an irrecoverable loss because, these forest floors, like in the coastal areas, they can be 1 meter deep in some areas. And they took 10,000 years to develop. And so if you're losing, what we're finding is that 60% of the forest floor is lost immediately with the act of logging.
Yeah.
It goes, where it goes, I don't know completely. But that 60% took a long time to get there. So you're right that when we continue, it's going to take that much time to recover it unless we do some innovative things, which I think there are things we can do. But the first thing is to stop doing that logging of these primary and old growth forests so that we're not furthering this irrecoverable loss.
Mm-hmm. Just stop it entirely.
And of course, many people will go, oh my God, we can't do that.
Well, economically, the forest sector in British Columbia is subsidized in a kind of intentional way, right? It would not actually be feasible with the current business model, correct me if I'm wrong, if we were not logging any of those old growth forests. That in a sense, it's the high value products coming out of those old growth forests that are subsidizing the cutting of the plantations that have been planted, which are nowhere near as valuable. Is that not right?
Yeah. The BC Truck Loggers Association estimates these plantations are about 1/4 the value of the old growth forest. I think they're pretty accurate, maybe even less valuable. Because they're still obviously targeting old growth forests as much as they possibly can because they're so much more valuable in the economic realm. And then ecologically, they're irreplaceable.
So imagine that we did stop logging old growth. Back a few years ago on the Mother Earth podcast, you were excited that the province had just announced that it was going to stop logging old growth forests. Has that come to pass?
So there was the Old Growth Strategic Review that was led by Gary Merkel and Al Gorley. And that was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And there were, I think, 19 recommendations that would have amounted to basically stopping logging these vulnerable old growth forests. And as far as I know, those old growth forests are coming down every day.
Yeah.
I mean, we go out in my Mother Tree crew and we go to these forests that were 1,000 years old and just logged last year. And we we're measuring the impact. So it's happening every day.
That must be heartbreaking.
It is, and it's so unnecessary. I think that's the part that is so heartbreaking.
So if we did stop that, let's still talk about clear cuts in the imagination that, of course, the forest industry is going to continue to log the plantation for us. You've proposed to retain some of the mother trees on the landscape as a way to mitigate some of these losses of the soil and mycorrhizal networks. How much would that help, and how many of the big trees would you need to retain in a forest?
So this mother tree project I started about 10 years ago, and it was, at the time I was thinking we need to address clear cutting, but and then devise all these treatments for alternatives to clear cutting. And what we learned in the process is, these losses of biodiversity and carbon pools. And I came to the realization that the number one thing that we need to do is what we just talked about, and that's stop logging old growth forests and stop logging primary forests. That's the first thing we learned. Yeah. The second thing we learned was what we sought to understand was retaining old trees, which we called mother trees. They're just the biggest, oldest trees in the forest. How do we retain those, and what patterns and different kinds of ecosystems, knowing that what you do in forest should be place-based. It should be about the ecosystem and the place, and it's not going to be the same answer everywhere.
Right. I just realized I was talking about retaining the big trees in a plantation forest, but that doesn't really make sense, right? Because they're pretty much even aged. I mean, they're the same age, and so they're probably pretty even sized. How does that play out, the mother tree idea in a plantation?
So plantations have some variety as well. It's not the same as an old growth forest. There's so many differences. Old growth, for one, the huge structure. So vertical structure, gaps in the canopy, regeneration coming up under old trees, all the biodiversity associated with old forests. It's an immense difference. But there is still some variety in a planted monotypic plantation. Yeah. Not all trees grow at the same rate. There's stratification. And so you can still work with those plantations and we're doing this now. We're trying to restore some of the coniferous industrial plantations that are kind of like biodiversity deserts. And we're focusing on the biggest trees in those, protecting those big trees, especially if they're iconic, trees that are valuable to First Nations, like cedar, for example, or even just the largest trees, and then using them as islands of recovery so that they're like attractants to biodiversity and that they advance or accelerate the development of old growth structures even in these planted forests.
And how many would you have to retain for it to make a real difference? Would it be like 1 in 100 or
It just depends on where you are.
Yeah.
So our project covers a climate gradient that's 1,000 kilometers long, and we've got 9 experimental forests across from dry, hot forests in Douglas fir all the way to the coldest, wettest at the northern reach of the limit of Douglas fir in British Columbia. And so it varies depending on where you are along that big climate gradient. Mm-hmm. So what we found is that when you're in really harsh environments, like very arid or very cold, that retaining high levels of overstory is what protects values the most. You still get regeneration, but you protect carbon pools and you protect biodiversity. So we tested up to 60% retention. So we're saying 60% retention works okay, maybe even higher.
Right. So not retaining 1 in 100 the way I was imagining. The way I think I had that picture in my head because of Lonely Doug, or some of these other cases where it's like one tree that you see standing. You're talking about.
And so then as it gets more productive, so in warm, rainy environments, like on the coast of British Columbia, we have a site that's near here. We find that you can take out more trees because the whole system recovers that much more quickly. So if you want to maintain vitality and diversity and productivity of the forest, you can actually take out 90% of the trees. That sounds like a lot. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind that the trees are big and productive and grow fast. But one of the things we're finding, even as we arrived at this conclusion of retaining 10%, we're finding as climate is changing and we get heat domes and these big stresses that even those old trees are very vulnerable as the singles. And so I've revised what I think that we need to leave clusters around the big old trees to protect them.
I was wondering about that. Yeah, that's fascinating. just going to ask. You mentioned climate change, and I wanted to go there anyway, especially in the context of fire. So I've been thinking about soils and mega fires, so climate-fueled fires that are hotter and burn a broader expanse of space than would have been normal historically, right? Lots of people don't realize that there is a pretty qualitative difference between the fires that we hear and read about, the ones that burn through whole cities or towns, and that burn all the way down to the mineral soil, right? And many people don't realize that's actually not how fire was most of the time in most of these ecosystems that you work in, right? That many of those fires would have just cleared through the underbrush, might have killed some of the adult trees, but actually might have left many of them intact in some contexts. There's such a difference there, right? Between the recovery of a forest where you have the soils and some of the adult trees versus one where you're burning it all the way down to, as they say, the mineral soil. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so most of British Columbia is characterized by what they call a mixed fire severity regime. And so that means that it's very patchy, just like you talked about. There might be some areas that are burned fairly severely. So that means a lot of the trees are dead, or even some of the forest floor is burned. But then there's big islands of other trees where it completely skips over, or it slightly burns through. And those are, healthy systems that rebound really quickly. These legacy trees seed in the areas around them that have burned, and so the forest recovers. And of course, we've outlawed Indigenous burning in British Columbia for over 100 years.
Yeah.
And that created conditions where the fires didn't burn so severely because the fuel loads were lower. And they did this burning too.
Sorry, it was the repeated burning that kept the fuel loads low and the fires less severe.
Yes.
Now that we've suppressed the fires, of course, it's adding to the climate warming and drying that is making those fires burn so hot.
Right. So, the fire, I'm not a fire ecologist, but there's like the fire triangle, and you need fuel, you need ignition, and you need the right climatic conditions. And so we have all those things, right? We have lots of fuel because we outlawed Indigenous burning. We have the climatic conditions. It's hotter and drier because of climate change. And then we have more ignitions, not just from people, but these drier, more climatically charged conditions create more lightning as well, because there's more energy in the atmosphere. And so all of those things are working together to create this very explosive situation that is playing out in our landscape.
And so thinking about your work in particular there, what that means then is that in those places where the fires are burning hotter, they must be recovering much more slowly, and they must be more vulnerable to becoming something different, something else, something less productive and less diverse than the forests that were burned. Is that right?
I mean, they're so extensive and so severe. And they're like moonscapes right after. If you drive through the southern interior, you cannot miss these extensive, huge, severe wildfires.
Yeah.
And they are, there is a recovery. So the native plants start to come back. If there's trees that live, they'll seed in, so that does happen, but it's slower. And then there'll be areas that burn so severely, and that's just ash, like really, really deep ash. Those are going to take a long, long time. I mean, really, you're talking about pedogenic processes that happen over hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Soil building.
Yeah,
that's okay. Got it.
But I would, there's one other thing that we're doing in the post-fire management of these places that is not, helpful. One of the things, and it's really...
And we being like Western industrial forestry, is that what you mean? Yeah.
Or the province, or whoever's managing the land. One is that we often grass seed these areas with domestic grasses so that...
For ranching?
Mainly. That's, and so they'll put cows on these areas as soon as possible. And, there's cattle grazing licenses all over the province and the forests, and these forests are not cow-adapted systems. And when they burn, they're especially vulnerable to cattle being in them. And I'm not trying to, to denigrate the ranching industry at all. I'm just saying that these places are really vulnerable. They need time to rest and recover. And adding cattle and grass seed back in them is not helping. But that is the go-to prescription.
Wow. Let's pivot.
Thank you, Suzanne. Some of the points that you broached in your conversation with Kai actually resonate very strongly with the 4 simple solutions that you shared with us in your TED Talk back in 2017. I'll just reprise. The first one, you suggested that we should increase local involvement, and that would really enhance forest stewardship to those specific locations, as you just mentioned. Number 2, you asked us, as you just enunciated, to save the old growth forests, and also not to stop cutting, but rather to cut less. And in doing so, you would save the legacies. And finally, you asked the audience to consider the very notion of letting nature heal, because mycorrhizal fungal networks are very resilient, right? But at the same time, it's a question of leaving nature alone for a while. So I was wondering if you could add something, a couple of points. What would you, given the time that's passed, what would you add to that list of simple solutions, quote unquote?
I'm so pleased that you read those. I had not reflected or listened to that since that was 2016, so 8 years ago, and I'm so proud of myself for enunciating those things. The one thing I would add right off the top is, not just local communities, that's really important, local stewardship, but honoring and upholding Indigenous stewardship. As we come to the truth of what happened with Indigenous people in Canada, elsewhere in the world, but let's talk about Canada. There's a lot to uncover here, and revealing the truth of what's happened to the people and their land and their relationship to the land. That underscores, it affects all of us. We think that we're not affected, but we are all affected by it. And the unraveling or the raveling of our ecosystems is one example of that. The First Peoples are the rightful stewards of these lands. They know these lands. Their culture, their governance is embedded in the land. It's about the land. Imposing a colonial recipe on that is a recipe for climate change. And so that's what I would amend first. It's not just local communities, it's Indigenous communities that need to be supported and upheld.
Thank you. And your book is very clear and transparent about a sort of intellectual debt that is owed to traditional Indigenous ways of knowing. You mentioned Mary Turner, for instance, and how she coined mother trees to refer to birches. And Bruce Miller, or Subier, whom you quoted in your talk as well, the notion of tree people. So intelligent beings who need to be understood as those with agency. I was wondering, Suzanne, if you could speak. I know that in your talk you shared with us the experience of Jigs, your family dog who had fallen in the outhouse, and how in his recovery you were able to see the layers, and that identification in another talk that you gave, that you were a child of the underground world. I was just wondering if you could think more recently, is there another sort of epiphanic moment or moment of like sheer illumination that just made you feel renewed in your quest?
One that stands out, there's so many moments. It's hard to say there's any one iconic one like that. But one that really made me sit up is I've been working with the Kwaika Nation. And the Kwaika Nation has a territory that's quite small. It's one of the smallest, if not the smallest nation in British Columbia. Their territory is in the Discovery Islands and on the mainland, just near Campbell River. They were removed from their territory in the late 1800s and through residential school systems, smallpox, as so many nations were. And then theirs was one of the first territories to be almost completely logged. And it's so thorough. And so I went there. The nation has basically restored their rightful sovereignty, or they're in the process of doing that over their lands. And they want to restore these damaged forests that have been converted to beautiful old growth to planted industrial plantations. And so I went there with them, and we were in one of the few old forests that were left. We climbed up this hill and we dug down, and the forest floor was a meter deep.
Wow.
It took me a long time, and finally I got my arm down, to my armpit down to the tippy toe of my finger, and I was going, okay, there's the mineral soil. So like a meter. And that was amazing because it's so rich, right? It's like centuries and centuries of accumulation and all those processes that the fungi and the food web are doing right there in that beautiful forest floor that is rich in carbon and all kinds of life. And then we went we walked from there into a plantation that had been logged not just once, but twice and then a third time. And we walked in, we had to basically break our way into this dense plantation where there is no room to move. There's no plants in the understory. And we dug, and I got my shovel and I put it in the ground, and clink, within a few centimeters, we were at the mineral soil. So that had such a big impact on me and all the people that I was there with. And it was that moment of being in that place and making that discovery, that visceral discovery, that we said we need to restore these places. And what are we going to do it? And nobody knows how. But we go back, to the basic principles. What created this forest in the first place? What do we have left after industrial that do we work with? What legacies are there? I mean, there's still seeds and spores in the forest floor. There's still living trees. There's still birds that live there, right? There's still marbled murrelets in the old growth, and there's still eagles coming in, and we want to create and, accelerate the vitality of their homes. And so out of that grew then this passionate co-development with the nation to restore their ecosystems.
I can only imagine how that would have been so stark, that difference, right? For somebody who, you now see the forest for its above and below ground life, right? And I think many of us would just be completely invisible to the difference, right? Just like perceiving the trunks above ground. And yeah, we could see that, we're having to crash through these branches because there's so much more undergrowth. But like the fact that there's a meter versus a few centimeters of that life below ground, that, maybe those centimeters didn't even continue much through the 2 or 3 rounds of clear cutting.
Yeah. I mean, and that, we put these forests on these short rotations, and already at 3 rotations, we're down to a few centimeters. It's just not sustainable.
As a consummate experimenter, including having your family members collaborate with some of your experiments, such as Robin, as well as your late brother Kelly and your father, for instance, how has your approach to learning experientially evolved, especially in view of you have many students and there's emergent technologies? Could you tell us a little bit about the adaptations that you've had to encounter and undertake?
Well, I've always strongly believe, and I still to this day, how I teach is that the best teacher for what I know is the forest. And so being in the forest is the first and fundamental thing. The lectures and the textbooks is all secondary. And I still believe that. And that's what I instill in my students. We're always out in the forest when I'm teaching here at UBC. And of course, I have a large crew called the Mother Tree Crew of students that have been with me for a decade. And they know the forest. They're forest ecologists because they understand how that forest ecosystem works. As far as the emerging technologies, yes, we incorporated all along the way too, because they're helpful. Things like, if you're going to measure the height of the tree, instead of, when I was a student, you would use tapes and clinometers. Then we moved to using rangefinders, and then we use lasers. And now we have satellite imagery, LiDAR imagery, that we can actually look at these things in a computer and calibrate our measurements with what the LiDAR tells us. And so we need to use all of these tools, and so we do. Yeah.
As a scientist, how would you define impact? What do you feel is the best measure of your own impact? For example, do you structure your goals around experiences and achievements, or what is the more precious thing for you?
Well, I think I've said it lots. But I'll reemphasize, the most precious thing for me is to see our forests protected and nurtured, and all the people who live in them protected and nurtured, and have vitality in their lives and well-being. That's what drives me. All this other stuff, like in academia, how many papers you publish and how many students you mentor, or whatever the numbers game is. I had to fall into that to a certain degree too, in order to be here. Otherwise, you can't exist here. But I think it's really good to always check on yourself and put it in perspective and say, what is my real reason for being here? There's so many things that we can talk about in academia or any kind of workplace that has all these, these drivers that make people ill, actually, or can make them ill, and how that ought to change. But I always tried to keep it in perspective. But I have to say that I also like Gabor Mate, because he also, in his own personal life, suffered from this problem too. That, we're all vulnerable to it. We're all in these systems trying to survive and get our needs met. But it's always good, if you can, to step back and say, what is my real purpose for being here?
Wonderful. I was wondering if you could speak about the difference between wisdom and then information, because oftentimes, if we think even back to the title of your best-selling book, you talk about the wisdom of the forest. Mm-hmm. What differentiates knowledge from wisdom?
That's a really good question. So you can read about a forest. You can know how to measure something. You can measure very complex things like you can look at all the DNA in the microbial community and say, I know about the DNA. But you might not have any idea of what the function is in that ecosystem. Or even if you had a small slice of one function, say, and this is, molecular ecology is a lot like this, where we can identify these suite of organisms, but, and we might say, oh, that one is good at nitrogen fixation. But every organism has a multidimensional life strategy. And so we only know that one little aspect. And so the wisdom part comes in understanding that there's so much more than we're ever going to have in the knowledge center. And so to treat the system wisely is to be humble and understand that it is about each organism working together, not as individuals, that it's a collaborative community approach to ecosystems, and that if you start, manipulating that system with your own idea that, we're going to create, and this is what's happened in forestry, we're going to create these beautiful big trees that are all the same species. Well, you're manipulating that entire system based on your singular objective without any wisdom about how that ecosystem actually works with this multidimensionality. So if we were wise, we would say the precautionary principle tells us we don't know everything, so let's keep these systems intact. That's wisdom versus knowledge.
Thank you so much.
Nice. Now we want to talk to you a bit about your experience as a science communicator and an activist, maybe, or advocate up to this point. So you've done a lot, and both in terms of, we've talked about your TED Talk, we've talked about your book. We didn't talk about this program that you ran as a principal investigator called TerraWeb, which was training students to be science communicators. And this is actually how you and I first crossed paths, where one of my PhD students, Paige Olmsted, went through that program. And she loved that program. And I think she's still using what she learned in that in her work at Smart Prosperity Institute. And so you've had all these different roles. Like, can you reflect a little bit When you think about helping society to better understand and take care of forests, what kinds of impacts have come from those different kinds of science communication approaches?
Yeah. I think maybe the first thing is to talk about the common thread that runs through it all. And yeah, it seems like it's been highly varied, but I've always had this drive to protect forests because they're my home. So I want to protect my home and all the homes of my ancestors and my children. That's what drives me. And as I went through my career, it was always like, okay, we're doing that, and that's not protecting my home. So I need to change that. Oh, I'm doing this to protect my home, but it's not actually resonating with the people who are affecting my home. So I need to change that. So I need to learn how to communicate better. So then I need to develop, there's an opportunity in NSERC to create a program so we're better communicators of science and climate change science. And so as we went through that, I was learning alongside the students. And so I remember one specific person that we brought in, and it was about telling stories. And he told us how to, what was like telling a story versus writing like a journal article. And they're like the complete opposite thing, right? A journal article or, the way scientists usually communicate is you lecture people. This is the way it is, right? This is what we did and this is what we found and therefore we conclude this. In storytelling, you invite them into the whole journey along with you and they're the discovery. They're avenues of discovery too. And you're both delighting in this discovery process. And then, at the end, there's like, wow, look what we figured out. That's a much more powerful way of conveying what we find in science than telling people and preaching to people. And so that led me to understand that there are different ways of communicating to meet my goal, which was to protect the forest. And so I started using those very techniques myself. I listened so deeply, I guess, and started employing those techniques to myself to protect the forest.
Yeah, and you can see the storytelling in your book, and I think in your TED Talk as well, because you're not just lecturing, you're not just telling us how it is. It's all packaged in the context of the story of your life, in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. But I want you to reflect a little bit for folks that are taking this approach. So I wonder whether your strategy has changed a little bit beyond that, those lessons, the things that you've learned along the way about science communication. Actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like you're moving towards a different model, in a sense, of science communication, where, from my perspective, as someone who was practicing science communication through that whole time as well, it was like our project as communicators of science was to relate the ideas from particular papers or from our body of work, right? It's like, okay, well, you have these findings about mycorrhizal fungal networks and mother trees, and so let's help people to understand that science and what it means for practice and policy. For me personally, like my journey changed, I think, really with the global assessment of IPBES, that intergovernmental platform, where I realized that it's not enough to do that kind of piecemeal. It's like, I have this little bit of science that ought to change this little bit of practice, because that's a very incremental approach, right? It's going to, at the best, we could change a policy about clear cutting to, one that might have some selective retention, and that might be marginally better. But, economically, that's probably not going to be the policy that saves the old growth for us, right? Like, it's unless the economics of the system change, then it's going to be hard to justify to not cut those biggest, most valuable trees, right? And so then I started thinking about it differently as being a practice where maybe we're orienting not around our particular science, but around the change that seems to be necessary given all that we know as a community. Do you feel like you've made any of that kind of a switch, or are you still orienting around like particular foundations?
Yeah, as I've learned from myself and my mistakes and my successes, and also as my goal has become more fulsome. It hasn't changed. It's just that it's more inclusive, I think, of small to large possibilities. And so has, of course, global changes over my lifetime has emerged as a global. It's not just about our local forests. It's the whole climate is affecting everything in my local forest. And so we have to think across all those scales. And I think that I've had to grow up to figure that out myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just communicating to, even just people in British Columbia. It's communicating this stuff around in a broader sense. It's to talk to people's sensibilities of how they view the world and view themselves in the world. And I've had to grow up into that and say, well, what is my worldview? And what is holding us up to solve climate change or global change? And I've come down to realizing it is how we fundamentally see the world. And so I've tried to move myself so I'm a more of an effective advocate of expanding our worldview and highlighting or lifting the voices of other people, especially Indigenous people who have a more inclusive and more mature worldview, I would say, than the extractivist worldview.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that, in part because the way I phrased the question sounded so leading if it wasn't right about that shift in your thinking. But I felt like I could see the way that you had embraced those bigger ideas. And in particular, so I want to pick up on that because many people in talking about your work and your book have talked about how it helps us to see the forest differently. Right. But just here, and this is exactly where I was thinking that we were going to go. Your work doesn't just help us see the forest differently. It helps us understand everything differently. Right. And so when you talked on the Mother Earth Project, they talked about reductionism versus holism. And I actually don't think that your science is holistic science. I mean, it is informed by holistic thinking, surely. But from my perspective, it's relational science, right? It's science that still employs reductionist methods. You're still using statistical approaches that any reductionist scientist would use, but you're starting the whole inquiry in a place where the relationships are the reality, right? It's not like we assume that the trees are separate individuals and that they're from separate species and then, they happen to be in connection this way or that way. It's like, no. We think about it like these are individuals of species that have been interacting in these ways for millions of years. They didn't come preformed into the forest. They actually became a forest together, right? And that, I think, that way of understanding the world, I think it should shift everything about how humanity operates within it, right? Because if we are a product of our ecosystems the same way that the trees are, and how could we not be, then why would we stumble around without that wisdom that you spoke to and just imagine that we can just change anything the way we like and it'll just work?
It's such a great question. And, just like in a forest, just like in human societies, we're relational beings. We're a product of our relationships. And we would not exist as individuals without all those around us in our relationships. And we've actually always known this as human beings. Like we evolved in the soup of everything else evolving at the same time. We're all co-evolved in relationship. And it was just in the last few hundred years that our, human hubris took over. Maybe it goes way back even further than that, but that we as individuals reign supreme and dominated over nature. And that also within our own societies that we can exalt an individual to become wealthy or powerful, and that they grew up that they're self-made people. None of that is true, right? And it actually destabilizes our societies when we create huge inequalities like that by exalting the individual. Obviously there's economic unrest, and there's, social inequalities that destabilize, but ecosystems are just not built that way. That there is, the diversity in relationships is what create a stable, robust, resilient system. Ecologists have known this for a long time. We as human beings have known about this for a long time. It's just that we forgot. And it came from a lot of, social movements through like the last 1,000 years that created these conditions. And now we have to unlearn it, or relearn what we already know.
And for a lot of this, we owe it to the many Indigenous people who have kept on reminding us, whose voices were long silenced, and, but whose messages have almost universally across space and time been about this relational reality. And
absolutely. And that we're all connected and we're all one. And they all, all those all those nations have words for these things. Many of those words lost, but they still exist today. We're all connected. We're all one. We're all in relation. We're all related.
Suzanne, we were wondering if you could talk about the notion of productive discomfort, where in order to experience some sort of learning, or at least like some sort of catalytic moment or realization, it's important to leave our comfort zone. Could you speak on that vis-a-vis your experiences with science communication?
Yeah. Productive discomfort. I like that. So, I actually am a pretty introverted person. I grew up like many people in not a perfect situation. And so I became, I was quite shy and introverted. And so speaking out in public speaking and standing in front of classes and big audience, never mind doing a TED Talk, is way beyond my comfort zone. But I always had this drive, because I grew up in my home, the forest, that I want to protect my home, the forest. And so I put myself out of my comfort zone and it, to reach my larger reason for being here, which is that reason. And it's not just about the forest, it's about all of us, right? The forest represents our healthy globe, planet. So I pushed myself to do that. And it has been, the rewards have been incredible. It rewards to me personally because I've grown so much and realized I can actually do that. But also that people are listening, and it's helpful. It's helpful for people to say, actually, we have this in us and we can do it in a better way. So it's great if you can get yourself there, you can do great things.
Absolutely. Canadian physician Dr. Dabar Mate has suggested in a podcast that we spend an enormous amount of our time justifying our existence in this world, and oftentimes we do so through workaholism. And what suffers then is the ability to spend time for rest or joy or play. And I was wondering, how has your work ethic changed over the years, and what brings you joy?
Well, I guess I'm also a bit of a workaholic. I think that anybody in the academic environment, even as students, that you are driven to this. It's a habitual thing and it's pressed upon you. But I cannot exist so I live in a little town called Nelson. I don't actually live in Vancouver because it's too stressful for me to be in this environment all the time. And so I go there to be in my home forests. I raise my children there. And my oldest daughter, who is just starting her doctoral degree down in Oregon State, she said, Mom, I came down here and everybody's talking about their models and their stats, and and I just realized that you're not very academic, Mom. You didn't talk about this stuff when I was growing up. And I realized, yes, I really did remove myself from it, even though I'm very passionate and my kids are passionate about the forest, and my husband at the time, very passionate about the forest. So definitely that passion was there, but the workaholism, talking about it all the time, we really didn't do that so much. We just went to the forest. And I don't know if that answers your question. But
Wonderful. Thank you. Ancient Greek poet Archilochus brought up the idea of the hedgehog and the fox. I don't know if you've come across that before, but he says that a fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one great thing. And then what Isaiah Berlin, a philosopher back in 1953, did was he categorized a number of different writers and thinkers as hedgehogs or foxes. The hedgehogs would center their own, for example, writing or achievements around a big idea or a goal, whereas the foxes would look at a multiplicity of different ideas and goals. Are you a hedgehog or a fox?
I guess I'm a hedgehog. Yeah, I mean, I'm always, I have a certain key philosophy of connection and oneness and to protect our vital systems. But that doesn't mean that I don't look at all these different techniques to do that. So I am jumping around and going, oh yeah, that's okay, well, wait till we develop that molecular tool and then I'll use it to meet my goal. Or wait till these remote sensing people really figure this spectral imaging out, then I'll use that tool. So I definitely will look around. I'm not blind, but I'm always centered on that one. It sounds like I'm so simple, but yeah.
We'll just say you're a hedgehog and a fox, which is the name of the book anyway, right? One of the signal lines in your book that I extracted was, I was tired, but I was on fire. Do you still feel that way?
Yes. I am every day I go, I'm so tired, but oh my God, we've got to do this thing, right?
Yeah.
So, yes. And so as I get into, I'm 64, which is shocking to me, but I'm moving into that elder part of my life, and I'm like, okay, what's my role? And I'm learning that role. I've been learning it for the last 10 years, and I'm tired, but I have a very big role to play still. And so, yes, I'm tired, but I'm on fire to play that role.
Seems like you're on fire from here. It's like part Lorax, part Katniss Everdeen, So what comes next, Suzanne? What do you have? And especially at this intersection of change and science, do you have ideas coming out of the last few decades, the big successes? I can only imagine there must have been failures, but I know about none of them. So,
so many failures, really.
Yeah.
What's next? I mean, did Kamala Harris think she was going to run for president? I doubt it. Maybe somewhere in her mind, she probably had it as a plan A, B, C, or D. But then that opportunity emerged and she went and she grew into that opportunity. And so I sort of, I'm not her, but I sort of look at how my life has evolved, and I learn and grow, and I go, that's where I'm going. And so right now, as an ecologist, I started learning about Indigenous knowledge systems about a decade ago, because I had a colleague, Teresa Ryan, who taught me so much and changed my life, really. And all the struggles I'd had in the forest industry of, we need biodiversity, we need to protect old forests, all the things I was fighting for, and I was getting all this pushback, and I was like, felt so diminished. And then she's just saying, this is our worldview, that we're one with these places. Of course, we're going to protect these systems. They are our systems. This is how we get, vitality and wealth, and, and it's our obligations and responsibilities to look after these places. And I'm going, oh my God. And immediately my life changed. And I thought, I'm always devoted to the forest, but the forest is the people. And I'm devoted to being in support of Indigenous people and regaining their rights to look after the land, to carry out their obligations. And that the forest and all the animals need that, right? They need their people because they're suffering from neglect, because the people were removed. And so at that moment, I said, that's my job is now, is to use all I know in the translation of knowledge so that governments will listen, so that they can regain their title and rights to their land, to be able to live their lives out the way they want to with their knowledge systems. It's better for all of us, for the whole planet. So that's where I'm going.
Yeah.
The specifics of it vary, but
Yes.
yeah.
Not just standing up for the trees, but also for the people who knew that we needed to protect the trees all along.
All along, yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This has
Thank
been
you. Very
amazing.
uplifting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And now for a short message from one of our conservation allies.
False Creek matters a lot to me just because it allows me and others to really connect with nature, even though we're living in a giant city.
We're fundamentally connected to the water bodies and the surroundings that we're in.
Blue spaces in particular are good for our mental and physical health.
Welcome aboard. I'm Zeta, and this is Water Bodies, a podcast from False Creek Friends.
The reality is that False Creek is actually quite alive.
How do we navigate the protection of these places that we love?
What do you imagine False Creek might look like in the next 10 to 20 years?
False Creek can become a beacon and a place to showcase the conservation efforts that are happening throughout the rest of British Columbia.
What it means to be a steward of a land.
Watch, listen, and subscribe to Water Bodies, wherever you get your podcasts. And visit falsecreekfriends.org to learn more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Small Planet Heroes. Small Planet Heroes is a production of CoSphere, a project of the University of British Columbia. UBC is situated on the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. Our guest this week was Dr. Suzanne Simard. Check out our show links in the episode description to learn more about their work and other ongoing projects. Small Planet Heroes was created by our executive producer, Dr. Kai Chan. This episode was edited by me, Emma Jarek Simard. Production is by Maya O'Donnell, Sam Blackwell, Emma Jarek Simard, and Claire Price. And your hosts this week were Dr. Kai Chan and Dr. Nancy Kang. Our show coordinators are Claire Price, Sam Blackwell, Maya O'Donnell, Dr. Nancy Kang, and Emma Jarek Simard. Special thanks to Jai Ranganathan, Bilal Bartai, Elizabeth Yee, Katie Kathirson, Dr. Nancy Kang, Anahita Siraji, Dr. Sarah Klein, and Zeta Schneider. Our theme song was written and performed by Daniel Forrest. Our interviews are conducted and recorded at UBC Studios. And if you'd like to join our community of Small Planet Heroes, check out cosphere.net. If you would like to support us, subscribe to our podcast channel, rate the show, and follow us on Instagram at Small Planet Heroes. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it and spread the word. Thank you for listening.